In this module, our focus is going to be on collusion and cartels, which are collusion's the action, a cartel is the organization of firms working together. A lot of what we talked about so far in class, we're talking about firms trying to maximize profits and how competition and strategy can sort of limit that, how they're left with choosing lesser actions, so think like limit pricing. They sacrifice profits to avoid new competitors entering the market. With collusion and cartels, it's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, where instead of competing, what happens if we get together and we agree on things, or we coordinate our actions and lead to greater profit that way, rather than worrying about competing against one another. So in this video, the focus is just sort of on, okay, what do we mean by collusion cartels? How do they function? What market characteristics are most conducive to them? What are some examples? Those sorts of things. And then in subsequent videos, we'll talk about some of the more specific details. So a cartel is an attempt to enforce market discipline and reduce competition between a group of sellers, suppliers. Collusion is the term for their action. A cartel is the group doing it. So OPEC, and I think I have this on a slide in another couple slides. OPEC is probably the most famous example of a cartel. OPEC is the organization of oil producing and exporting countries, something along those lines. I never can keep straight what OPEC stands for, but it's all the countries that have great oil supplies and sell their oil to the world. And they get together and they meet and they decide exactly how much each one's going to produce, and they target a price and all these things. It can be things other than price, though. They can decide that they're going to divide things up maybe geographically, in that, look, we're going to let you take this section of the country or the world, and we're going to focus on this section. Some of the videos I will link to in this module are from lysine, and we talked about lysine in a previous module as well with Archer Daniels Midland. So lysine, there's FBI undercover video. It's not very high quality video, but there's FBI undercover video of these firms sitting down and colluding and deciding who's going to have what market share, who's going to get so much of the increase in demand, who's going to charge how much in this area. So it's very elaborate. It's not just prices. They're targeting market shares, they're targeting quantity, they're targeting sections of the world, all these sorts of things. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just all about prices. It can be about a whole bunch of different factors that they want to agree on that lessen competition and increase their profits. So cartels are a fairly common thing, and I say that loosely, in that you don't have to search hard to find examples of cartels, but in most of, let's say, the developed world, so think in Europe and the US, they're illegal. So yes, they're there, but they have to behave in certain ways so that they don't face antitrust laws. And again, those lysine undercover videos that the FBI has that I'll link to in this module are examples of what happens if you do it within the US. But they're out there, and like in the case of OPEC, they're literally sitting down, renting out hotels, and there's media that show up to their meetings, and they make announcements and proclamations about exactly what their goals are and those sorts of things. So when I say they're common, it's not that they're everywhere, and they're by far, most industries do not have cartels. But what I mean by that is it's not hard to find examples. And especially if you look in the antitrust literature, even though it's illegal, there's lots of people that have been caught colluding with one another, and we'll talk about some of those examples. So it's around, it's a real thing. A lot of times it's very subtle, and we'll talk through some of this. Very subtle and hard to prove that it's collusion versus something else. But it's more common than one would probably initially suspect. Okay, so when we say that it's more common, but it's subtle, so things like the publication of price sheets and the formation of producer associations, which are really common, it can be argued, and in many cases it has been shown, that those types of practices actually facilitate collusion. That a producer association where they have quarterly meetings or yearly meetings supposedly to talk about overall trends in the industry and stuff. When you get that many competitors together in a room, they talk, they form friendships, they go to dinner together, those sorts of things. It can definitely facilitate collusion. And in fact, you can find examples where these producer associations were developed for the sole purpose of facilitating collusion. Price sheets, and we'll talk about this later in this video, the more information you have about what your competitors are doing, the easier it is to maintain collusion, because they can't cheat on the agreement without you finding out. And they know if their prices are going to be published on these price sheets, that they can't cheat on the agreement for very long without being caught. As I mentioned before, antitrust makes this illegal, so they can't have literal contracts, which would be the answer to this in a lot of cases, is, well, if you can't trust each other, and this is a game theory thing, you can't trust each other, you have a best response that's other than the collusive outcome, well, then just contract on it. Just say you have to do this. But you can't contract on things that are illegal, and collusion is illegal, so you can't make a contract that is legally binding that says you're going to do this, you're going to do that, those sorts of things, because it would end up with you paying huge fines, and we'll come back to that issue later, and for a lot of the executives involved, some jail sentence. So what is most conducive to cartel formation? And some of this hopefully is intuitive. It's not that every industry has a cartel. There's lots of industries that don't. So why do we see it in some and not in others? So first and foremost, you need sufficient profit motive. There has to be enough money within the industry. And if you think of like the monopoly outcome as being the highest level of profits within the industry, and then competition erodes away that level of profits. Collusion is getting a bunch of firms to sort of act very similar to monopolists. So the larger that monopoly profit is relative to how much we make competing, the more conducive it is to maintaining collusion. So think of, again, the oil industry. There's a lot of profit within that industry. As these large producing countries, though, start competing, that profit starts to erode. So they have an incentive to collude. Means by which agreements can be reached and enforced, again, can't be done by contracts in a lot of countries. But there's some places that don't have such rules, and so you can. So how hard is it to do that? And then stable market conditions. If the market, so some of what's going to be going on with collusion cartels is for them to actually maintain their agreements, you have to be able to detect. So going back to that price sheet thing, you have to be able to detect what your competitors are doing. If the market's constantly fluctuating all over the place, if 1 year demand's way up and the next year demand's way down and all of these things are going on, it's really hard to determine what's your competitors are doing versus what just is normal market forces. The more stable the market is, the easier it is to detect what your other firms are doing to ensure that they're following through with the cartel or collusive agreement. for the going back to the monopoly profit issue, so two things that are really important in terms of why you see cartels some places and not in others. You need a relatively inelastic demand. So going back all the way towards one of the first couple modules, if demand's inelastic, that means quantity is not very responsive when price changes. So think oil, gasoline, those types of things. We need it for cars, machines, all kinds of things. So our demand is not very responsive to price changes. We buy roughly the same amount. We don't change dramatically. That helps facilitate collusion. That increases the amount of monopoly profit because as a collusive agreement, we can start to raise price and we're not going to lose much in the way of quantity. If we don't lose much in the way of quantities, we start raising price, that's just pure profit for us. The other thing is you need restricted entry because much like when we were talking about entry and exit in that module, we talked about, maybe sacrificing, again, going back to limit pricing, sacrificing profits to keep potential entrants out. If we're going to start to raise prices and make more profits, that's going to make the industry more attractive to potential entrants. And as we get more entrants, that erodes our collusive agreement. So you need an industry where entry is fairly restricted. So think oil. There's only so much oil in the ground, and the countries own that oil, the member countries of OPEC. And so it's really hard for someone new to just suddenly create a bunch of oil and enter that industry. In terms of limiting entry, assuming it's not some kind of resource where there's only so much, a common way is to have trade associations again, or a common marketing agency to channel output overall, not so much a firm's output, but output overall. So maybe you have an agency that a bunch of, and I'm just using this as an example, I'm not implying this is going on, but you have a bunch of corn farmers that get together and they hire an agency who is going to be responsible for selling all of the corn produced by all of these different farmers. That agency then has control, almost acts like a monopolist there, and the members give the corn to them, and then they go out and they sell the corn. And so it's not so much a Farmer Jones corn versus Farmer Smith's corn, it's just you're buying corn. Now, consumers tend to be savvy on this, and so they have to be convinced that this is a good idea. So oftentimes this is advertised as it lowers search costs. To have a common marketing agency, there's one place that a buyer would go to get access to corn or apples or whatever it happens to be, and so it lowers their search costs. They don't have to go to all the different farmers and find out how much they want for their corn and how much corn they have available. It can also be pitched as greater security of supply because since it's sort of this collective group of output, if one person doesn't have quite as much one year, it can be made up for by someone else, and then wider access to maybe some variety to the extent that there's different types of corn or whatever we're talking about. So these can sort of limit entry because it's then hard for new firms to get in and enter these associations and stuff. The existing firms have some control over that. In terms of how, we've talked a lot about the benefits of cartel formation, but in terms of some of the costs for cartel formation, which also tell us sort of why we see it in some industries and not others, it's time-consuming and costly, so everything has to be negotiated. In general, it has to be hidden. And it also has to be monitored. We have to be able to verify what the other firms in the cartel are doing. We can't just take their word for it. So factors that reduce those costs, a small number of firms / high industry concentration makes negotiation and punishment and monitoring easier. If we're trying to have a cartel with 150 firms, it's awfully hard to keep track of what 150 firms are doing. If we have trying to have a collusive agreement with 4 firms, that's much easier to know what's going on. It's easier to negotiate and come to an understanding. So we're generally going to see this. The more concentrated the market, the more likely it would be for some collusion and cartel behavior. Similarity in production costs. So if you have very similar production costs, you can come to a quicker agreement on prices and output. If you vary dramatically, and you'll see a little bit of this in the FBI undercover video, if you vary dramatically in terms of your production costs, it's much harder to come to an agreement because what might be an ideal price for one firm is not ideal for the other. And similarly, having products that are similar and not very differentiated, so oil, for example, is very helpful. The more differentiated they are, the more consumer preferences come into play, the harder it is to maintain this collusive agreement. Frequent market interaction is really important in terms of these costs. If you think of our repeated games, our sequential games, those sorts of things, if you have less frequent interaction, there's a long time before you discover cheating and you can punish it, and it makes it more likely that a firm is going to go ahead and cheat to get the short-term gains and sacrifice some long-term profits, because that short-term is a longer period of time. Again, not suggesting that this particular business is colluding by any means, but if you think of driving down pretty much any street in a large city, you're going to come across gas stations. And those gas stations have reader boards right out front with big LED or neon lights saying, here's our current price for unleaded plus, for unleaded supreme, for diesel, all these different things. That type of price interaction would facilitate collusion, because if I come to an agreement, let's think of one intersection, and let's say there's, it's probably maybe extreme, but maybe not in some cases. Let's say every corner of the intersection has a gas station. So there's 4 gas stations within an intersection. If we decided to collude on prices and raise prices, if one firm cheats, well, they're advertising their price right out front. All I have to do is look out my front window and say, hey, that's not what we agreed on, which is much different than a different industry where I don't see their prices until they put out their quarterly earnings, or if it's a private company, it may be even longer. I have to kind of read tea leaves. I can't see exactly what it is they're doing. In terms of stable markets, things that help there, accurate information so that you can tell what's going on. Trade associations and marketing agencies, again, can come into play here. So you can sort of see some of these recurring themes. Not that every single example of a trade association means there's collusion going on, but it's definitely beneficial to maintaining and helping with collusion. So it's sort of a something that should be paid attention to rather than a guaranteed signal that that is what's going on. What constrains cartel formation? So again, they violate antitrust laws, and there are lots of examples. I'll do that in a different video of firms violating antitrust laws and getting charged and hit with very, very significant fines and jail sentences. Because they're illegal, they cannot be enforced by legally binding contracts, so it has to be sort of taken on faith that your competitors are actually going to follow through with the agreement. It has to be hidden because it's illegal. You can't be sort of out and open. It's got to be secretive. And they tend to be unstable. There's always an incentive to cheat on the cartel agreement. OPEC, for many, many years, they would meet like every other month. And OPEC, Google them, they're a very interesting organization. They'd meet and they'd agree on here's how much production each member state is going to produce. They'd then go home, and inevitably a couple of the countries would produce more to try and get some extra profits. And so they would never be able to get the prices quite where they wanted them because the firms would cheat on the agreements. They've gotten better over time with this. My thought is probably because as alternative energy has taken more and more hold, they've come to the recognition that, okay, we're not just competing with each other, we have another form of competition out there, and so we need to be careful what we're doing. Examples of cartels. So in New York City, the schools is the largest single food customer outside of the Department of Defense. And on June 1st, 2000, almost all of the companies that supply food to New York City schools were charged in a bid rigging scheme that overcharged the city at least $21 million. The defendants reportedly designated which of the companies would be the low bidder on contracts. Now, again, it has to be covert. It can't be obvious. So there's all kinds of examples of companies coming to an agreement that can seem random, but doesn't require much communication. So one of my favorite examples is where, and let me check the next slide. Okay, so one of my favorite examples is companies that have sat down and they've agreed based on the phase of the moon. So full moon, half moon, waning, all those sorts of things, which firm would be the low cost bidder. And the other firms simply raise what they would bid normally by 20%, and the winning bidder puts in their normal bid. So they don't have to talk after reaching that agreement, and it's random because it's based on when the request for estimates comes out, what the phase of the moon is. And the thought is, well, sometimes it's going to come out in this phase and I'll be the winner, and sometimes it'll come out in that phase and you'll be the winner. They can be very kind of sophisticated like that, or they can be fairly basic. No. Other examples, again, I hate to keep harping on it, but OPEC, NASDAQ, and matching up bidders and sellers of stocks and those sorts of things. They've been accused and found guilty of collusion in some cases. Airlines, again, fairly concentrated market, not a lot of firms, reasonably stable demand, so that meets all those definitions. And they have had all kinds of collusion cases brought against them, and sometimes they've been found guilty and sometimes they've been found innocent. They tend to have a much easier time justifying what they're doing and saying, well, we're doing a price leadership model, we're doing all these different things, we're not out and out colluding.